I want to start by reading a small bit from the novel Nora Webster. It's more or less as true as I could make it to something I remembered, which was that my father died in the summer of 1967, and for weeks afterwards there were a lot of people in the house. But then when it got into the autumn, got into September, October, we were back in school, myself and my younger brother, people just started to come in ones, so you never know who was coming. We didn't have a telephone, so you never know what to expect. And knock would come to the door, and we'd always have an argument over which of us would go out to answer it. And then my mother would be in the back room, and if you didn't know the person, you'd bring her into the front or him into the front room. If you knew them, you had to make a lot of decisions. So I just want to, I'm just going to start by reading this opening. This is 1967. You must be fed up of them. Well, they never stop coming. Tom O'Connor, her neighbour, stood at his front door and looked at her, waiting for a response. I know, she said. Just don't answer the door, that's what I do. Nora closed the garden gate. They mean well, people mean well. Night after night, he said, I don't know how you put up with it. She wondered if she could get back into the house without having to answer him again. He was using a new tone with her, a tone he would never have tried before. He was speaking as though he had some authority over her. People mean well, she said again, but saying it this time made her feel sad, made her bite her lip to keep the tears back. When she caught Tom O'Connor's eye, she knew that she must have appeared put down, defeated. She went into the house. That night, a knock came at almost 8 o'clock. There was a fire lighting in the back room and two boys were doing their homework at the table. You answer it. The boys are 12 and 8. You answer it, Dawn said to Connor. No, you do. One of you answer it, she said. Connor, the younger one, went out to the hall. She could hear a voice when he opened the door, a woman's voice, but not one that she recognized. Connor ushered the visitor into the front room. It's the little woman who lives in Court Street, he whispered to her when he came into the back room. Which little woman? She asked. I don't know. May Lacey shook her head sadly when Nora came into the front room. Nora, I waited until now. I can't tell you how sorry I am about Morris. Morris is the name of Nora's husband, who has died. She reached out and held Nora's hand. And he was so young. I knew him when he was a little boy. We knew them all in Friary Street. Take off your coat and come into the back room, Nora said. The boys are doing their exercise, but they can move in here and turn on the electric fire. They'll be going to bed soon anyway. May Lacey, wisps of thin grey hair appearing from under her hat, her scarf still around her neck, sat opposite Nora in the back room and began to talk. After a while the boys went upstairs. Connor, when Nora called him, was too shy to come down and say goodnight, but soon Domhnall came and sat in the room with them, carefully studying May Lacey, saying nothing. It was clear now that no one else would call. Nora was relieved that she would not have to entertain people who did not know each other or people who did not like each other. So anyway, May Lacey went on, Tony was in the hospital bed in Brooklyn. Until this man arrived into the bed beside his and they got talking, and Tony knew he was Irish and he told him his wife was from the county Wexford. She stopped and pursed her lips as though she was trying to remember something, and suddenly she began to imitate a man's voice. Oh, that's where I'm from, the man said. And Tony said that his wife was from Enniscorthy, and oh, that's where I'm from too, the man said, and he asked Tony what part of Enniscorthy she was from, his wife, and Tony said she was from Friary Street. May Lacey kept her eyes fixed on Nora's face, forcing her to express interest and surprise. And the man said, that's where I'm from too. Isn't that extraordinary? She stopped, waiting for a reply, and he told Tony that before he left the town, he made that iron thing, what would you call it, a grill or a guard, on the windowsill there at Jerry Crane's. I went down and looked at it, and it's there all right. Jerry didn't know how it got there or when, but the man beside Tony in the bed in Brooklyn, he said that he made it. He was a welder. Isn't that a coincidence to happen in Brooklyn? Nora made tea as Domhnall went to bed. I should say that that was a sort of I'm the Domhnall watching this conversation, wondering why they're talking like this about people I don't know, that no one knows. And I should say that that grill, that metal grill she described, is there to this day at Jerry Crane's at the top of Friary Hill as it hits Court Street in Enniscorthy. And I mean, she did say that, and all that did happen. Nora made tea as Domhnall went to bed. He brought it into the back room she brought it into the back room on a tray of biscuits and cake. When they had fussed over the tea things, May Lacey sipped her tea and began to talk. Of course, all of mine thought the world of Morris. They always asked for him in his letters. Morris was a great teacher. The boys looked up to him. I always heard that said. And Nora then started to think about May Lacey. She did not think that May Lacey went out much except to the shops or to Mass on Sunday. They were silent now, and Nora thought that maybe May would go soon. It's nice of you to come up and see me, she said. Oh, Nora, I was very sorry for you, but I felt I'd wait. I didn't want to be crowding in on you. She refused more tea, and when Nora went to the kitchen tray, she thought that May might stand up and put on her coat, but she did not move from the chair. Nora went upstairs and checked the boys were asleep. She smiled to herself at the thought of going to bed herself now, falling asleep and leaving May Lacey down below, staring into the fire, waiting for her in vain. Where are the girls? So May is asking Nora about her daughters. As soon as Nora said that, I never see them now. They used to pass up and down all the time. Oh, Anya's in school in Bunclody. She's settling in there now, Nora said. And Fiona doing her teacher training in Dublin. You'd miss them when they go away, May Lacey said. I miss them all, but I do. But it's funny, of all of them, it's Eilidh I think about most. It was something I don't know. I just didn't want to lose her. I thought after Rose died, you know all this, Nora, that she would come home and stay and she'd find some sort of job here. And then one day when she was just back a week or two, I noticed her all quiet and it wasn't like her. She started to cry at the table, and that's when we heard the news that her fellow in New York wouldn't let her come home unless she married him. And she had married him there without telling any of us. Well, that's that. Then I said, you'll have to go back to him, sorry. And I couldn't face her or speak to her. She sent me photographs of him and her together in New York, but I couldn't look at them. They were the last thing in the world I wanted to see, but I was always sorry she didn't stay. Yes, I was sorry to hear she went back, but maybe she's happy there, Nora said, and immediately wondered, as May Lacey looked down sadly, a hurt expression on her face, if that was a wrong thing to say. May Lacey began to rummage in her handbag, and she put on a pair of reading glasses. Anyway, eventually she goes. What happened then was that I started this book in the year 2000, and I was going very slowly at it and doing anything not to go on with it. And in the middle of the whole thing, I went to Texas, and I taught for a semester at the university there, and it was the first time that it happened to me really that I had actually wanted to go home. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Texas, you know, I mean, I don't want to complain, but I just missed Irish things I don't even like, you know, Irish weather, Irish food, the news in the morning, you know, on the radio from Ireland. But it occurred to me, you know, especially in the morning, that I wouldn't mind going back if I was going back today. And anyway, I then, of course, started to think, well, this is, of course, what's happened to so many people from Ireland over the years. Every generation, since the famine really has, you know, lost somebody in this way. Someone has come to America or Australia or come to England and realised after a while, this is the nearest I'll have now to home, or that I'll have two homes or I'll have no home. And I didn't think about that much. I just got on with what I was doing. But what happened was that when I came back, I decided, partly out of laziness, that I would read over this chapter. I mean, I probably should have been writing the next one. And I found that story. And whatever was in the story, whatever just was in those few phrases of that woman talking about her daughter, that in itself was a story. And was enough, maybe, for a story. I didn't know what size or what sort of story. I thought just maybe a short story about her coming back, taking off the wedding ring, not telling, all of that. And then it just got longer, and it became the novel Brooklyn. And I'm just going to read two bits. But the first one is really the first time that Eilish in Brooklyn begins. She's working in a shop called Bartocci's. She's staying in a boarding house run by Mrs. Keogh. There's a ban in the boarding house on any discussion of politics or religion. So they mainly talk about what my mother and my aunts talked about, which was clothes. And of course, it's the time of nylon, where nylon's being mass-produced. And there's been a huge sale in Bartocci's where Eilish works, which is called Bartocci's famous nylon sale. I don't know. I mean, this is I suppose people must remember. One of my aunts got a ladder in her stocking, in a nylon stocking, to try and put a bit of nail varnish to stop it. But it would nonetheless be something that would be talked about. God, a ladder in your stocking. So Eilish gives Mrs. Keogh a present of a pair of nylon stockings. Mrs. Keogh seemed pleased by the pair of stockings and offered to pay for them, but Eilish said they were a gift. That evening during supper, they all talked about Bartocci's famous nylon sale, which always happened without warning. They were amazed when she told them that even she who worked there had no idea when it was going to happen. Well, if you ever hear even a rumour, Diana, one of the lodgers, says, you have to let us all know. And the nylon stockings are the best. They don't run as easily as some of the others. They sell you garbage, some of those other stores. That's enough now, Mrs. Keogh said. I'm sure all the stores are doing their best. With all the excitement and discussion surrounding the nylon sale, Eilish did not notice until the end of the meal that there were 3 letters for her. So these are her first letters from home. She's been getting used to work, she's been getting used to the boarding house. These are now 3 letters from home. Her sister is Rose, her brother is Jack. Jack's in England, Rose is still in Enniscorthy, where her mother lives. The minute she came back from work every day, she had checked the side table in the kitchen where Mrs. Keogh left letters. She could not believe that she'd forgotten to check this evening. She drank a cup of tea with the others, holding the letters in her hand nervously, feeling her heart beating faster when she thought about them, waiting to go to her room and open them and read the news from home. The letters she knew by the handwriting were from her mother and Rose and Jack. She decided to read her mother's first and leave Rose's until the end. Her mother's letter was short and there was no news in it, just a list of the people who were asking for her, with some details of where her mother had met them and when. So my mother used to do that sometimes. Instead of writing me a letter, she'd just list people in the town asking for me, and just say, best wishes. It would go down like that. Jack's letter was much the same, with reference to the crossing that she told him about in her letter. Because she had a terrible crossing, from England to America, and she didn't want to tell the others, but had said very little about it in her letter to her mother and Rose, as she did not want to upset them. Rose's handwriting was, she saw, very beautiful and clear as usual. She wrote about golf and work and how quiet and dull the town was, and how lucky Eilish was to be in the bright lights. In a postscript, she suggested that Eilish might like sometimes to write to her separately about private matters, or things that might worry their mother too much. She suggested that Eilish might use her work address for those letters. The letters told her little. There was hardly anything personal in them, and nothing that sounded like anyone's own voice. Nonetheless, as Eilish read them over and over, she forgot for a moment where she was, and she could picture her mother in the kitchen, taking her basiled and bound notepad and her envelopes, and setting out to write a proper letter with nothing crossed out. Rose, on the other hand, she thought, might have gone into the dining room to write on paper she had taken home from work, using a longer, more elegant white envelope that her mother had. She imagined that Rose, when she was finished, might have left hers on the hall table, and her mother would have gone with both letters in the morning to the post office, having to get special stamps for America. She could not imagine where Jack had written his letter, which was briefer than the other two, almost shy in its tone, as though he did not want to put too much in writing. She lay on the bed with the letters beside her. For the past few weeks she realised she had not really thought of home. The town had come to her in flashing images, such as the image that had come during the afternoon of the sale, and she thought, of course, of her mother and Rose, but her own life in Enniscorthy, the life she had lost and would never have again, she'd kept out of her mind. Every day she'd come back to this small room in this house full of sounds and got over everything new that had happened. Now all that seemed like nothing compared to the picture she had at home of her own room, the house in Friary Street, the food she'd eaten there, the clothes she wore, how quiet everything was. All this came to her like a terrible weight, and she felt for a second that she was going to cry. It was as though an ache in her chest was trying to force tears down her cheeks, despite her enormous effort to keep them back. She did not give in to whatever it was, but kept thinking, attempting to work out what was causing this new feeling that was like despondency, that was like how she felt when her father died and she watched him closing the coffin, the feeling that he would never see the world again and she would never be able to talk to him again. She was nobody here. It was not just that she had no friends and family, it was rather that she was a ghost in this room, in the streets on the way to work, on the shop floor. Nothing meant anything. The rooms in the house on Friary Street, on the other hand, belonged to her, she thought. When she moved in them, she was really there, in the town, in Enniscorthy. If she walked to the shop or to the vocational school, the air, the light, the ground, it was all solid and part of her, even if she met no one familiar. Nothing here was part of her. It was false, empty, she thought. She closed her eyes and tried to think, as she had done so many times in her life, of something she was looking forward to, but there was nothing. Not the slightest thing. Not even Sunday. Nothing maybe except sleep. And she was not even certain that she was looking forward to sleep. In any case, she could not sleep yet, since it was not yet 9 o'clock. There was nothing she could do. It was as though she had been locked away. When I was writing this book, for the first time, people from outside were coming to Ireland as emigrants. And so there was a sort of boom on, and news got around, and people from China came, and Nigerians came, and Polish people came. And I watched, I was a bit surprised that Ireland was not welcoming outsiders with open arms. And in a way, it's one of the sort of ironies of history, isn't it, that we had gone everywhere. We made ourselves at home wherever we went. And now people were saying, well, these outsiders, they were using funny words like non-nationals. Non-national. And it wasn't a simple matter. I mean, people who didn't like non-nationals discovered they did like them, and they got to know them. And it worked around the school, for example. If your kids were in school with a non-nationals kids, suddenly the non-national became a friend of yours. You know, it's a complicated story, but when I was writing the book, I was aware that maybe with all this money coming into Ireland, the country was actually forgetting the way in which how poor it had been and how many people had left it. There was also something else going on, which was that there was a big change in the way the Catholic Church or Catholic clergy were viewed. And but there was a lot of news about abuse and paedophile priests and all those issues. And it struck me, you know, I was going to put a priest into this book, that in all those societies where Irish people went to, and people will be able to tell you this, who went to Australia, you know, in these years, or went to England in these years, or came to America in these years, that the parish was often the centre. And that at the centre of the parish was a man, a priest, who looked after people. He talked about God on Sunday, and said Mass, and did those priestly things, but the rest of the week was busy organising things for people, making sure that everybody was okay. Sort of fixer, sort of dealer as well as a priest. And I thought, actually, this figure needs to be in this book, and also if anyone thinks that I'm going to join the band and make him into some abuser or predatory figure, it's not going to happen in this book. Someone else can, write some other book, but it's not going to happen in this book. So Father Flood in this book, I just need to let you know now, he's going to appear, he's a good man, and he's going to stay. I don't want to give the plot away, but he stays a good man. And he gets worried about her because she's homesick. And he gets her into night classes at Brooklyn College, and he just looks after her generally. He's worried mainly then about the first Christmas away from home, what's going to happen, because it's a time before, they didn't have a telephone, so she just spent the day thinking about home. So he organises that all the men who have nowhere else to go on Christmas Day, as he says, the men who built the tunnels and the bridges, that they, people have nowhere else to go, he will feed them. He'll try to get turkey and ham. He'll go around cajoling people to make him turkeys and ham, or cook him turkeys and ham. And two Miss Murphys, the women from Arklow, they will help, and he wants Ailish to help as well. So all of them get involved in feeding these figures. There's a strange thing happens there, because she hasn't seen anyone from home for so long. When a man comes in, there's a moment where a man comes in, and she thinks, well, I'll just read you this bit. The Miss Murphys were anxious for the men who came first, this is Christmas Day, to gather at one or two of the long tables, enough to make a group who could be served soon with bowls of soup, so that the bowls could be washed and used again by the next group. As Ailish on instructions went out to encourage the men to sit down at the top table nearest to the kitchen, she observed coming into the hall a tall man with a slight stoop. He was wearing a cap low over his forehead and an old brown overcoat with a scarf at the neck. She paused for a moment and stared at him. He stood still as soon as he had closed the main door behind him, and it was the way he took in the hall, surveying the scene with shyness and a sort of mild delight, that made Ailish sure for one moment that her father had come into her presence. She felt as though she should move towards him as she saw him hesitantly opening his overcoat and unloosening his scarf. It was how he stood, taking full slow possession of the room, searching almost shyly for the place where he might be most comfortable and at ease, or looking around carefully to see if he knew anybody. As she realised that it could not be him, as she was dreaming, he took off his cap, and she saw the man did not look like her father at all. She glanced around her, embarrassed, hoping that no one had noticed her. It was something she thought that she could tell no one, that she'd imagined for an instant that she'd seen her father, who, as she remembered, quickly dead for 4 years. Although the first table had not been filled, she turned and went back to the kitchen and set about checking the number of plates for the first serving, even though she knew she had the right number, and then lifting the lid of the huge saucepan to check if the Brussels sprouts were boiling, even though she knew that the water was not hot enough yet. When one of the Miss Murphys asked her if the nearest table had been filled up and if every man had a glass of stout, Ailish turned and said she had done her best to move the men to the tables, but maybe Miss Murphy could do better. She tried to smile, hoping that Miss Murphy did not notice anything strange. By the time they were removing the trifle dishes, the hall was a mass of smoke and animated talk. Men sat in groups with one or two standing behind them, others moved from group to group, some with bottles of whiskey and brown paper bags that they passed around. When all the cleaning of the kitchen and the filling of garbage cans had been completed, Father Flood suggested that they go into the hall and join the men for a drink. Some visitors had arrived, including a few women, and Ailish thought as she sat down with a glass of sherry in her hand that it could have been a parish hall anywhere in Ireland on the night of a concert or a wedding, when the young people were all elsewhere, or dancing or standing at the bar. After a while, Ailish noticed that two men had taken out fiddles and another a small accordion. They had found a corner and were playing as a few others stood around and listened. Father Flood was moving about the hall with a notebook now, writing down names and addresses and nodding as old men spoke to him. After a while, he clapped his hands and called for silence, but it took a few minutes before he could get everyone's attention. I don't want to interrupt the proceedings, he said, but we'd like to thank a nice girl from Enniscorthy and two nice women from Arklow for their hard day's work. There was a round of applause, and as a way of thanking them, there's one great singer in this hall, and we're delighted to see him this year again. He pointed to the man whom Alice had mistaken for her father. He was sitting away from Alice and Father Flood, but he stood up when his name was called and walked quietly towards them. He stood with his back to the wall so that everyone could see him. When Alice looked up, the man was signalling to her. He wanted her, it seemed, to come and stand with him. It struck her for a second that he might want her to sing, so she shook her head, but he kept beckoning, and people began to turn and look at her. She felt that she had no choice but to leave her seat and approach him. She could not think why he wanted her. As she came close, she saw how bad his teeth were. He did not greet her or acknowledge her arrival, but closed his eyes and reached his hand towards hers and held it. The skin on the palm of his hand was soft. He gripped her hand tightly and began to move it in a faint circular motion as he started to sing. His voice was loud and strong and nasal. The Irish he sang in, she thought, must be Connemara Irish. But she remembered one teacher from Galway in the Mercy Convent who had that accent. He pronounced each word carefully and slowly, building up a wildness and ferocity in the way he treated the melody. It was only when he came to the chorus, however, that she understood the words. Ma vientulam bilam astorin magri. And he glanced at her, proudly, almost possessively, as he sang these lines. All the people in the hall watched him silently. There were 5 or 6 verses. He sang the words out with pure innocence and charm, so that at times when he closed his eyes and leaned his large frame against the wall, he did not seem like an old man at all. The strength of his voice and the confidence of his performance had taken over. And then each time he came to the chorus, he looked at her, letting the melody become sweeter by slowing down the pace, putting his head down then, managing to suggest even more that he had not really learned the song, but that he meant it. Alice knew how sorry this man was going to be and how sorry she would be when the song had ended. When the last chorus had to be sung and the singer would have to bow to the crowd and go back to his place and give way to another singer, as Alice too went back and sat in her chair. As the night wore on, some of the men fell asleep or had to be helped to the toilet. The 2 Miss Murphys made pots of tea and there was Christmas cake. Once the singing ended, some of the men found their coats and came up to thank Father Flood and the Miss Murphys in Irish, wishing them a happy Christmas before setting out into the night. When most of the men had left and several who remained seemed to be very drunk, Father Flood told her that she could go if she wanted, and he would ask the Miss Murphys to accompany her to Mrs. Kill's boarding house. Alice said no, she was used to walking home alone, and it would in any case, she said, be a quiet night. She shook hands with the 2 Miss Murphys and with Father Flood, and wished each of them a happy Christmas before she set out to walk through the dark, empty streets of Brooklyn. She would, she thought, go straight to her room and avoid the kitchen. She wanted to lie on the bed and go over everything that had happened before falling asleep. And one of the things about this, I suppose the most intense emigration from Ireland came from the West Coast, from a line going down from Donegal, Sligo, Galway, Mayo, Clare, Limerick, and Kerry, and West Cork. And of course that's the part of the country where the traditional music is still most vibrant, where the tradition has been handed on from generation to generation. The problem, of course, was that that part of the country was poor, so they didn't have a recording studio. And I mean, there's a wonderful moment when Irish radio starts to send out in the 1940s and 50s an actual mobile recording studio run by figures like Sean McGraven and Ciaran McMahon, who would literally go to those places and record people. So we have recordings made in those years in that way. But the best early, when the revival came on traditional music, there was a great revival in the 1960s, and it's still there, that revival. I mean, it's still very strong, the tradition now. It's become even stronger than it's ever been before. But one of the great archives was the American archive, that while there were no recording studios in Donegal, you could rent a basement studio to record in New York in the 1920s, and I always had this vision of two sort of Irishmen in coats, black coats, one with both with fiddles, standing at the top, waiting for a number of jazz musicians, African-American men, who've hired for an hour, to finish up, sort of passing each other as the two men go down to make their recording, having booked the recording studio. But anyway, we have that, I was thinking about that whole idea of people coming with no money to America or going to Australia or England, but actually some of them having something. I was thinking in particular about one singer, a singer called Joe Heaney, or Joseph O'Haney, even though he emigrated in the 60s. There's a wonderful story about it that, he had thousands of songs. He was the best singer of his generation in Ireland. He's still one of the greatest singers we've ever had. And but he had nowhere, he had no way of making a living. So they got him a job as a doorman in an apartment building in New York. But he was famous in Ireland still, and there was a bar called O'Donoghue's in Marion Row, and they had a photograph of him on the wall because he was a famous singer. And two people came from New York, and they were having a drink in the bar, and they looked at the photograph and said, "That's Joe, our doorman." And someone said, no, that's Joe Heaney, our singer. And the story ended that he actually went to work in a music department of a university, and John Cage ended up actually writing an oratorio for him that's based on Finnegan's Wake called Oratorio. So the story goes right around from doorman to being sort of cutting-edge figure in contemporary music. The problem I had when I finished the novel Brooklyn was that I was still thinking about Nora Webster all the time. In a way they're companion books in that Eilish in Brooklyn is very much the younger sister. My mother had two younger sisters, certainly one of whom was bossier than the other, and certainly they both worked in it's named in the book. And in the film, actually, they went and got the notepaper from that actual office, S and A.G. Davis in Enniscorthy. They both worked in the office there, but I was imagining if one of them hadn't got a job, and one of them had the job, well, the one who had the job would have organised the other one. She would certainly have sent her somewhere. I imagined one of my aunts going to America, in that year. But this, but my mother was older than them, but nonetheless, they're all women of that generation. And so I went back and tried to finish this book over a good number of years. And one of the problems I had was that this is 1967, and I thought, God, it feels like 1957. Like this is a small town in Ireland, but it's the 60s, and the 60s are so famous. If you're writing a novel set in the 60s, you put in the twist. Well, she certainly didn't do the twist. And Elvis Presley appears, but only as just as an aside. So I better put something from the 60s into this book. And I was thinking about, drugs, sex, and rock and roll. We hear so much about. Well, there were drugs, all right, but a doctor could prescribe them for you. If you were sick, you go to a shop and get them. No, I tell you, the other sort of drugs, there were none. I was there. There were none. But I suppose alcohol. There was alcohol. I was thinking about sex. I mean, there was sex, but it was really between consenting adults in the dark, who were married, and to each other. And the rock and roll didn't really make much. Didn't make much of it. But I thought there was one thing that really did matter, and that was that women in Enniscorthy, in one particular year, towards the end of the 60s, the entire female population of the town over a certain age all had their hair dyed. It was an enormous shock. I mean, that you would go to a friend's house and his mother would come out and, well, she'd gone all gold, But the autumn had come, and everyone had a different hair colour. And it was talked about a lot at home. It was a big subject of discussion, who had got their hair dyed and how. And then, of course, it hit us, So, on Wednesday morning, Nora went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie and the hairdressers about a new system of dyeing hair she had read about, wondering if it was time that she did something about the grey. I wouldn't like it blue, she said. I know what you mean, Bernie replied. And if it was too black, then it would look dyed, and I was never blonde. Everyone in the town knows I was never blonde. Is there a good brown, so that it might not look dyed? I could try this one. Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. Maybe just start off with a small bit, she said. No, the instructions, Bernie said, say to use the whole thing. I've used it before. It's very popular. You'd be surprised who hasn't. Well, try it so, Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner, for the boys' dinner is in the middle of the day at this time in Ireland, she regretted having come here at all, and she knew that she would have to go soon. She signalled to Bernie, who was now busy with two women who had come in together and appeared to need to consult each other by each tip of the scissors. I'll be right with you, Bernie said. When she came over to remove the net, Bernie told her not to worry, or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. Nora was aware that the two women Bernie had been looking after were studying her closely. Nora wondered if she should not have consulted other women before getting her hair dyed for the first time, but she couldn't think of anyone she could have asked. Both of her sisters, she presumed, dyed their hair, but she never heard them talking about it. Slowly, as she watched Bernie working with the hairdryer, she realised that she was being given the hairstyle of a much younger woman, and that the women watching it all happen knew that and were taking it in with considerable satisfaction. The more Bernie worked, the more her hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, but in the mirror, she could see how pleased Bernie was with her work. There would be no point in complaining. Is it not a bit young for me, she asked. I think you look great, Bernie replied. This cut is very fashionable at the moment. I've never had a fashionable cut before, she said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on the way home would think that she had lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a young woman rather than someone who was recently widowed. It'll take a few days to get used to, Bernie said, but no one has grey hair anymore. Does the dye not look very unnatural? In a few days it will lose that look, and people will think you've had it all your life. You look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you? No, but it will fade, and I guarantee you that you'll be back here in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to return to the grey, but maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well. Highlights. I don't think so. Outside, she lifted her head high and hoped that all the women in Court Street and John Street would be busy cooking, that none of them would be standing at the door. She prayed that she would meet no one she knew. In her mind, she went through the worst possible encounters, the people who would most deplore the idea that with her husband 6 months in the grave, she had dyed her hair a colour it had never been before. She thought of Jim, her brother-in-law, and knew that she would have to face him and Margaret within a week. They would not know what to think. As she saw Mrs. Hogan from John Street walking towards her, Nora could not tell whether Mrs. Hogan simply did not recognise her, or if she wanted to get by her without making any comment. Just as Mrs. Hogan approached her, she seemed almost to jump. Her face quivered, and then she stopped. Well, that will take some getting used to. Nora tried to smile. Was it Bernie? Mrs. Hogan asked. Nora nodded. I heard she got in some new packets, all right. God, I must go to her myself. If Mrs. Hogan, in her apron and a pair of very worn-looking shoes, felt she had the right to comment on Nora's hair, then Nora felt no reason why she could not comment in reply. Well, you know where she is, she said dryly, looking at Mrs. Hogan's hair, clearly suggesting that it could benefit from some treatment. It took Mrs. Hogan a moment to take in the possibility that she was being insulted. The encounter made Nora feel brave. She would stop for nobody else, she thought, but she knew that what had happened was a mistake. She wondered if she'd ever done anything like this before in her life, acted on a whim without any thought for the consequences. Before she was married, she remembered she came back from work one day at dinner time. She found a stall of old books outside Warren's Auctioneers at the bottom of Castle Hill. As she perused the book, she found a volume of poems by Browning, one of whose poems she had loved in school. She was flicking through the pages when she was joined by old Mrs. Carty from Boring Hill. We both checked the price of the book, which was written in pencil on the inside page. It was far too high, and in any case, Nora had no money. They both walked away and moved together along Friary Place and up Friary Hill. As they parted at the top of the hill, Mrs. Carty handed her the book from under her coat. "No one will miss that," she said, "but don't tell anyone where you got it." Walking home with her new hair dye reminded her of walking into her mother's house with that volume of Browning's poems. It was the same feeling of guilt, the same feeling that someone would follow her and find her out. Quickly, when she arrived home, she boiled some potatoes and opened a tin of peas and put 3 lamb chops on the pan. When the boys arrived, the potatoes were not ready. She waited upstairs, calling down to let them know that their dinner would be a bit late. She sat in front of the mirror, at the dressing table, and tried to work out if there was anything she could do to her hair to make it look more normal. She wished she had told Bernie not to use the lacquer, which was sticky and had a sweet smell. As soon as the boys, who were 12 and 8, as soon as the boys saw her, they both became quiet. Domhnall looked away while Conor moved towards her. He reached up and touched her hair. "It's all hard," he said. "Where'd you get it?" I had my hair done this morning," she said. Did you like it?" "What's under there?" Under what? "Under what you have on your head." "What I have on my head is my hair. Are you going to go out like that?" Domhnall glanced at her and looked away. Just before I read the last bit, when I started to, the first novel I wrote was set in Spain, that I had lived in Barcelona, and it didn't occur to me, those few streets in Enniscorthy that I've been describing, that there would be enough in them to give you a novel, that there was enough drama, enough colour, enough life, just enough material for a novel. And and also I've been reading Hemingway, and I thought that that's where you wrote novels, that you set novels in Spain. So I had the characters, both of them oddly enough were from Enniscorthy in Spain. It was the 50s and there was quite a lot of, sex anyway, forget the drugs. There's a lot of activity, let's say. It's a good word, activity. And towards the end of the book I realised that I was sort of finished. That I couldn't think of anything more to do with them. They'd gone to Barcelona, they'd gone to the mountains, they had come up against the sort of strange politics of the dictatorship. They had, met other people, they had looked at a lot of art, they had really loved the heat and the weather. But I needed to do something else to them. And then it occurred to me, I'd bring them home. I'd bring them back to Wexford, I'd bring them back to Ireland. And that actually was the story I was working towards all along. It would be as though in The Sun Also Rises, Jake, instead of going back to Paris, someone dragged him back to the Midwest, where he belonged. And so that all he did then was remember those years, those bullfights, those trips, those fishing trips, remembered because he had lost that life. So I couldn't think about, would I bring them back to the town? Once again, I was resisting the idea of the town as a place where you could set fiction. And I tried to write short stories set there, but they were sort of satirical, making fun of people in the town, and they didn't work at all. It was sort of wrong. So I realised, of course, that my father was a teacher, and we could go every summer for longer holidays than most people. You could rent huts or stay even in a farmhouse for very little money along the Wexford coast. This is just the east coast to the south of Ireland. And a lot of people from Enniscorthy would come in July and August. So it would be an enclave from Enniscorthy. The locals, the name for us, they call us the bathers. Because of course the locals would never dream of getting into the sea. I mean, the sea was the enemy almost, because they had farms and they did a bit of fishing, but the idea for pleasure of taking off most of your clothes and getting into the water, it was insane. So, I mean, they called us the bathers, and the arrival of the bathers, and they'd say things like, of all the bathers, and anyway, so I brought them back to a place called Ballyconnegar Lower, which is also called Keating's. We used to go to Ballyconnegar Upper, and where there are cliffs and there's erosion. And there's still erosion. I mean, to this day, the last few years, another house fell over, or the cliff would eat in. And it's unpredictable, you can never tell. There are Dublin people who have a house over there, hasn't been touched, where there's been no erosion for 20 or 30 years. I mean, they have a shock coming, but for some reason, maybe they have a special prayer or something, but whatever it is, they haven't been touched for, or they're growing some special tough grass, I think. But whatever it is, they haven't been touched. But you could go along further, and suddenly in one winter, the clay, which is very weak, will just eat in, and another house will go. My father, his first cousin, Dick Whelan, Dick's house fell in, and you can still see the back wall, because once it got the house, it got obviously fed up. It just didn't take the back wall. It's still there to remind us all that this was once a house. And in fact, the Irish painter Tony O'Malley lived in Enniscorthy, where he worked in the bank in the 1940s. And in the 1980s, so about 40 years after he'd left the town, he had a touring retrospective. And it came to one of the other towns, and he came back to Enniscorthy not having been in the town for 40 years. And of course everyone knew him. I mean, everyone recognised him, and he was talking to various people when a woman went by, and she stopped and said, "Tony, yeah." And she was the daughter of the boarding house where he had stayed, which is on Court Street, Hayes' boarding house, and said as she was going, "Oh, by the way, that suitcase you left, if you ever got time, or it's still there for you anyway, anytime you want to take it." And the suitcase was filled to the brim with drawings and watercolours and gouaches that he thought he had lost in those, because he moved from a few towns, and his wife Jane said, that there's work of yours missing. That, all that preparatory work where is it? And it was all in the suitcase. But some of it included drawings and watercolours made of the Wexford coast, the coast I'm talking about, in the 1940s. It included drawings, and I've seen them, and watercolours of a hill behind Keating's house. That hill has completely disappeared. So the drawings are accurate. I mean, if he says a place, that's what the place is like. But of course, people will think in the future that he must have made up that hill. But he didn't. It was there then. It just isn't there now. At the beginning of Nora Webster, they have a small house, and she decides she's selling the house after her husband dies, and she'll never go back to that place again. That's over. And she gets a job. She's having a lot of trouble at work, and one day she finds that she almost stabs. Well, she doesn't really, but she has a pair of scissors in her hand, and she's nearly going to stab the woman she works for with the scissors. Instead, she just walks out and finds herself out on the street. Her old car is nearby. She doesn't want to go home, and she decides she'll actually go back to this place and just take a walk. Just remember, her husband was called Morris, and so she stopped in Blackwater and bought a packet of 10 Carol cigarettes and a box of matches. She'd not smoked for years and promised herself that she would not smoke all of these cigarettes either, just 2 or 3 before throwing the packet away. When she inhaled, she felt dizzy, and that made her remember how tired she was. She'd been suffering from insomnia. She threw the cigarette out of the window and then put her head back and fell asleep. When she woke, she spotted a woman standing on the bridge looking over at her car. As the woman approached, she started the engine. Nora was tempted to drive to Cush, but she doesn't. She decides not to drive straight to the cliffs, to go to the next place, which is called Ballyconnegar Lower or Keating's. She had not expected to find a haze over the water. Oh, I need to say that, so there's Ballyconnegar Upper, Ballyconnegar Lower, and then if you go further down, you go to a place called Ballyvaloo, which is still there. And there still is a retreat house of the Sisters of St. John of God there. And when we were kids, it was very exciting because the nuns, even though it was after Vatican II, the nuns would still appear in their full habits. And so they were praying. Anyway, they were walking along, and either totally in black or totally in white. And you'd shout, "Mammy, Mammy, look, nuns!" And there would be two nuns. And then if you go further south again, you end up at Curracloe, which is where the beach gets longer and there are sand dunes, which is very like a beach in Normandy. So it's where they shot Saving Private Ryan, because it was, it's like a Normandy beach. It's also where they shot the beach scene in the film Brooklyn, and they had to shoot it in March, which of course caused a lot of talk locally. Because you could be a famous actor all you like, but you're getting into the water. And it seems that the girls, the two actresses, were much braver than the two young men. And of course, it being a film, they had to do take after take. Just imagine it in March, you're done, you're already, Anyway, they had to do take after take, and so that's called Curracloe. So anyway, she's in Ballyconnegar Lower. She had not expected to find a haze over the water. She sat in the car in front of the Keating's house and looked down in the direction of Rosslare, taking in the heavy milky light that lay over the strand going towards Curracloe and Raven Point. When she got out of the car, she felt how unusually close and humid it was, as if there was thunder coming. She put on a pair of flat shoes that she kept in the car. There were no other cars in the car park. She walked carefully on the stony stretch between the grass and the river, across a small wooden bridge, and made her way south. In all the years she thought she'd never come here, even as late in the season as October. She imagined now how strange it would be in December and January, how storm-swept and wintry, and how biting the cold. There was hardly any colour. The world in front of her had been washed down. If she moved nearer to the shore, she could look at the small stones that made a rattling sound when the wave broke over them. She saw how exact the colour of each stone was, and it allowed her to forget work, and stop worrying about what she would do. She could barely see ahead of her as she walked. It might have been easy to imagine that this was a place that belonged more to Morris than to her. It was the world filled with absences, with merely the hushed sound of the water and stray cries of seabirds flying close to the surface of the calm sea. She could make out the sun as it glowed through the curtain of haze. It was unlikely that Morris was anywhere except buried in the graveyard, where she'd left him, but nonetheless the idea lingered that if he or his spirit was anywhere in the world, then he would be here. She thought it almost natural that if his spirit were on this stretch of the strand, he would have his own concerns. The details of her life, her job, or what might happen in the future with the children, these would be matters that would seem as vague to him as the far distance did now to her, things that would pass as his life had passed. What had happened in the days before his death, the blockage in his system that caused him to cry out so his voice could be heard through the hospital, that would be with him now more than anything else. It came to her again, his death. She pictured those who were there, Jim and Margaret, his brother and sister, and then Sister Thomas, the nun from the convent of St. John of God, who had said special prayers, and then old Father Quaid. For the last 2 days, Nora herself had stayed by his bedside, but he was already far away from them, so far that they might have been like shadows, people already lost to him. Maybe he could only imagine them all as vague presences, the ones he had loved, but love hardly mattered then, just as the haze here now meant that the line between things hardly mattered. As she reached Ballyvaloo, the luminous great whiteness was moved down the strand by the mild wind towards Curracloe, and she saw there was a single nun walking back towards the lane that led to the retreat house of the Sisters of St. John of God. Wearing a full black habit, she walked slowly and with difficulty. Nora thought she must be one of the retired nuns who often came here on holiday or on retreat. When she was closer, she saw that the nun was Sister Thomas. Nora was surprised that she was in Ballyballoo. She had not known that she ever spent time away from her own convent in the town. She moved towards her, and when she reached her, Sister Thomas greeted her, put out her hands and took both of Nora's hands and held them. Suddenly, Nora felt cold and began to shiver. She could hear a wind blowing, almost whistling in the distance, but when she looked out at the sea and down the strand, it all seemed calm. There was no sign of the haze lifting. You shouldn't be here on your own, Sister Thomas said. I was in Blackwater this morning to see a friend, and just a while ago she saw you fast asleep in the car, and then driving towards the strand, and she phoned me in the convent because she was worried and wanted to know what she should do. So I walked down here in case I would find you. Who saw me? I thought I would come down to the shoreline to see if you were here, Sister Thomas said quietly. I don't often leave the retreat house. Today is more like heaven than earth down here. I saw her all right, Nora said. Someone who can't mind her own business. That is one way of putting it, Sister Thomas said. Someone who's looking out for you. Sister Thomas released Nora's hands. I was not surprised to see you down here, she said. It was meant to happen, us meeting like this. This is how the Lord works. Don't tell me how the Lord works. Nora said, don't tell me that again. When Morris was dying, Sister Thomas said, I asked the Lord to make it easy for him and for you. I have no needs of my own. And I had not asked him for anything in a long time, but I asked him for that, and he denied me what I asked. There must have been a reason for saying no, and the reason is hidden from us. But I know that he's watching over you, and maybe that is why we met, so I can tell you that. He has not been watching over me. Nor is it no one has been watching over me. I knew when I woke today, Sister Thomas said, and said my prayers this morning, that I was to see you. Nora was silent. So turn back now, before the fog comes down so hard that you won't be able to drive home. Sister Thomas, go home. The boys will be home soon. The boys will be home from school waiting for you. I can't work there anymore. She shouts at me. She said things today that made it impossible for me to stay. It'll be all right. It is a small town and it will guard you. Go back to it now. Stop grieving, Nora. The time of that is over, do you hear me? I felt as I walked along here, Nora began. We all feel that on days like this, Sister Thomas interrupted, and even on other days. It is why we come here. Those who have passed on have it for shelter on their way elsewhere. It is nice to be among them on a day like this. Among them? Nora asked. What do you mean? We walk among them sometimes, the ones who have left us. They're filled with something that none of us knows yet. It is a mystery. She held Nora's two hands again and then released them, and then turned and walked slowly as though in pain back towards the dunes and the lane leading to the retreat house. Nora waited to see if she would look back, but she did not. So Nora stood for a while without moving, looking out at the sea still covered in haze. And then she began to make her way along the strand towards where she left the car. The scissors, she threatened Miss Cavan, were on the front passenger seat beside a packet of cigarettes. She put the cigarettes in the glove compartment, but took the scissors out of the car and left them down in the gravel for someone else to find.